This video is about how to make very complicated looking buildings using really simple templates. A few videos ago, I built these. I built them so that I had enough terrain to fill a 6x4 city ruin build, and they were all done using 50mm XPS foam. But in this video, I want to focus all of my attention on this kirk. But looking at it now, it's a bit small, and you deserve something much bigger. I know, I keep banging on about them, but using the same templates that I used in my last video, I designed and printed out a full-scale cathedral. I tried working out all the dimensions in my head and it wasn't working for me, so I actually built a small test piece that I could refer back to and started taking plenty of note. And the first job, prepare some of the templates and we can get to building. The first step was preparing all the 50mm XPS foam sheets that I was going to need. These templates and the foam sheets were cut to be 83mm in height. That is a measurement that has been taken directly from some GW plastic kits. I just used some small bulldog clips to hold everything together, ready for cutting. The measurement of these windows from floor to sill, again taken from plastic kits, although the overall size of the window is ever so slightly bigger. This is for two reasons. Firstly, to make them easier to see through when playing, and secondly, because I actually intend on adding some 3D printed windows, a completely unnecessary step. I printed this out full scale so that I don't need to use a ruler for the building process because I can find that can slow me down. Don't get me wrong, I love a ruler as much as the next man, and I'm not sure I should be sharing this, but I actually collect them. Anyway, back to the build, and I need to cut this door out. Believe it or not, getting this bit right is actually the most complicated part of the entire build. If you look at old cathedrals, they tend to have really thick walls. And I can build that up by overlapping these foam sheets, and it'll also give a lot more visual interest to the final build. And all the information that I need to make this work is on this printout. I can just use a pen to make little marks on the foam so I know exactly where everything needs to be, and if I get it right, it'll make the whole process really easy. The doors in all of these templates, well, you guessed it, they're also scaled to the same as plastic kits. And this first piece is absolutely bang on. Then it's just a case of rinse and repeat, and we can start gluing everything together. Just following the notes that I had taken on the printout, a couple of hours later, we had this. I wanted to make the doorway a little bit more grandiose, and there's a few other details I need to take care of, and then the actual front of the cathedral is done. You'll have to excuse my big fat head in this video. It was quite tricky not to get in the way of the overhead camera. The glue I used to glue all these pieces together is Gorilla wood glue. I've got a couple of bell towers that I want to add to the top of this thing, and I'm using some baking parchment to aid this process because of course nothing sticks to baking parchment. While I had the hot wire table out earlier, I also cut a bunch of 10mm by 10mm, 10mm by 5mm strips so that I can use those to fill any gaps that I needed to. And of course, like the plonker that I am, for this piece, I managed to glue it on the right side, thought it was the wrong side, glued it on the wrong side, thinking it was on the right side, and then had to glue it on the right side again.
Und plonker, yeah?
I glued some of the 10mm, 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 5mm strips together, and I'm going to use those like cornerstones to attach all the walls. I I glued an arch on the inside to the side wall of this cathedral to mimic the internal architecture of a classic cathedral. And I repeated the layering aesthetic on the inside, but only one thin piece this time. And I tried experimenting with a centerpiece on the inside of the front of this cathedral above the door, but honestly later abandoned that idea. And if you see those little notches on the front part of the cathedral between the second and third story, my plan is to run a 10 by 10 mil strip of foam out of that notch across to the top of this arch. And once everything was glued together, we look like this. These triangular pieces I've added to the front there to emulate the sloping roof, and they've been cut using the same templates so that all the slopes on this building are the same angle. And using those 10 by 10 and 10 by 5 strips, I've added some buttresses. The corner buttresses are set back buttresses. My favourite type of buttress. I've got a couple more buttresses to add to match the depth of the central piece, and they will sit right here. And they have been cut at a particular height, again, to follow the same angles that we've been using elsewhere on the build. So with these simple templates and some fairly basic construction techniques, it's not hard to produce really complicated looking buildings. I'll leave a link in the description and probably a pinned comment to let you know where you can get your own copies of these templates, because I do make them available for each and every one of you. These angular roof supports are the only bit where I haven't used a template, and I just cut them by freehand using the 10 by 10 mil strips I cut earlier. Don't like the next stage of making ruins because it's a bit make or break. So being Scots, there's one easy solution to calm one's nerves. Sláinte. I've got a fresh blade in my box cutter and it's just time to start hacking away. I don't like this part because if I cut too much off, I've got to start the whole process over again. So I do like to take my time and really think about the pieces that I am cutting away and the overall composition of this building. The other thing I try and do with ruins is when I'm building them, I try to build them 10 to 20% bigger than I actually want them, so when it comes to the cutting away, there's less chance of me fucking it up. Then, using my thumbnail, I'm just going to lightly dig in to all of the sharp edges on this building. This will help roughen and round off a lot of those sharp edges. It will also take out some little chunks of foam, and at this scale, really helps sell this building as being part of a ruined or war-torn city.
To base or not to base? That is the question.
And this was your answer on our community tab. But I can't say I'm the biggest fan, and I'd like to refer you to Winter's SEO.
So, stones before the lichen. I like putting them around the buildings and where pipes are and things like that. Oh, and this will become part of your hobby arsenal, not just something you watch someone else use. You're going to need one of these to tidy up your stones and bit things. When you're done, it looks like this. I'm basically using the rocks to frame a lot of the battlefield that I've put down already, but also not being afraid to overdo it in certain quarters. As far as the game is concerned, the rules are concerned, the rocks are the battlefield. They're the table. They play no part in affecting the models and things, but they do look cool.
Winters puts together some of the best tables you'll ever see, and I feel like there's got to be a compromise between basing and set dressing. And these ruins are made of foam, so we've got the other issue that we need to add some weight to them. I tried adding some screws to parts of this ruin to try and help that issue, but honestly it made absolutely no difference. I think I've got an idea, and if it works, it solves a myriad of problems. It'll add enough weight to these ruins, It won't compromise gameplay. It'll certainly satisfy the basers. And one of my biggest pet peeves about basing ruins is we invest so much money in gaming mats, or we invest so much time in making our own gaming tables, that when you put a based ruin onto those things, it covers up all the work that's gone into the aesthetics of these mats or boards. And for me, could completely take away the immersion. And this building is a prime example of what I mean. It just doesn't look like it should be there. The basing just doesn't match the battle map at all. And to be fair, I don't necessarily think that it needs to match. If we can come up with some sort of generic base that suits the building, but doesn't suggest any kind of environment, then we should, theoretically, be able to place that building into any environment. The first step for that in this process was gluing and pinning these chipboard pieces into place on the underside of the ruins. I also added some flagstones in the doorway and in the expanse between the bottom of the arches on both sides. This is just to add a little bit more structure and make the next step easier. For this next part of the video, we have to refer back to the Kirk because, like a f***ing idiot, I deleted a bunch of footage. Get ready for the reverse audio sync. These are chalky, porous white stones, the kind you find in a driveway. They've been washed, they've been in the oven for 20 minutes at 150 degrees Celsius, and you will have noticed that when I stuck the cardboard to the cathedral, on the outside of the building, the cardboard was thicker than the actual plan of the building. And the reason for that was so that we could glue stones in place to act as rubble. After all, these buildings are supposed to be ruins. When that was completed on the cathedral, it looked like this. And next up, I've got a big tub of small to medium grade aquarium stones. To apply these, I've traced out footprint of the building onto some baking parchment. And then with some wood glue, I'm going to run a fairly thick bead all the way around the outside of the plan that we've traced from the building. I'm afraid you will have to excuse my big fat head again. This part of the build was very difficult to film and not get in the way of the camera. But what I'm doing here is just lining up the building with the original traced drawing. I follow that up by putting a fairly liberal coat of glue on the cardboard that is still exposed. And then comes the stones. I lay these stones fairly excessively. I'm using way more than I'm going to need, but as the glue dries, I want as many of them to stay in place and stick to that cardboard as I possibly can. Inevitably, this does mean I'm going to have a little bit of cleanup to do, but if I only have to clean it up once and not repeat this process every single time I put a board together for a game, I'll be a happy man. I do try to push them all together to make them as tightly packed as possible. A little bit of glue squirts out somewhere around there. More stones. For now, I'm just going to leave this to dry. Go and spend some time with the wife. Because we are working with a PVA-based glue, inevitably, some of it's not quite cured yet because, as we all know, you need air to get to the PVA glue to help it cure. So I'm just going to leave the building like this for another few hours so that it has enough time to cure thoroughly. After using filler to fill any of the gaps, I textured and sealed the foam using Mod Podge, gesso, some water, and some fine sand. The Mod Podge and gesso was mixed around 50-50, and I used some water to thin it down a touch. The sand was then added so that I could just see the grains as they rose to the top of the surface as I was mixing it all together. And this was the resulting consistency. This was applied just using the same brush, and then once everything had dried, I took the whole thing outside and hit it with a rattle can of, I can never get the name of this paint right, Standard Mechanicus Grey. No, that's wrong. Mechanicus Standard Grey. It also had a zenithal highlight with Army Painter's Uniform Grey. The difference between these two paints is quite subtle, but I like both the green and blue pigments that have been used to make these greys. You can still see some of that Mechanicus in the recesses, which is exactly what we want. Next up, everything got a liberal coat with a homemade black wash. This is not a fancy wash. This is literally just matte medium, black paint and water. And when I say liberal, I really do mean liberal. I slathered this everywhere, paying careful attention when it came to actually putting the wash on the stones because I wanted to sink in between every single one. Next up was a series of dry brushes, starting off with a neutral grey. So not complicated, just a 50-50 mix, black and white paint. This is just to bring back some of that lightness that we've hidden with all of the black wash that we put on in the last stage. I'm not trying to do anything fancy with the brush, this is just a dry brush. Next was Uniform Grey, which is a little bit lighter than neutral grey we were using previously, but this time I was starting to focus on light. So all of my brush strokes in this process with this particular colour were forced downwards. And yes, staring at your builds lovingly really does help the paint. After that, I switched both paint and brush. Now I am really honed in just to essentially painting light. So what I'm looking to do is pick out any of the raised edges in terms of the dimension, but also those edges that are towards the top of the build that I know will catch some of the light. So I'm looking at the windowsills, some of the ruined edges, and areas where there's a clear change in the dimension of the building. I'm also trying to subtly force contrast, and you can see from this shot all of the paints that we've used, you can still see. You can see all the way down to the standard Mechanicus Grey. After this round of dry brushing, I've just got to pick out a few details and we'll be done. And this is what we ended up with. The details that I've picked out, obviously I've painted the Aquila, I've added some Army Painter's strong tone into some of the recesses to suggest dirt and moisture build up. Some more strong tone up the vertical channels where the dimensions meet to try and help force that contrast just that little bit more. Let me show you again. I'm sure my mind's failing. I added some moss, which is just all different types of flocks ground down with PVA glue mixed to create a paste, and a few tufts as well. And this is what we've ended up with. And even though I'm saying it, I think it's turned out pretty well for a very simple build. Oh, I also ended up with these, which I've built as test pieces. So out of one project, I've ended up with enough finished terrain for a board. Right, I've had enough of me, so I'm pretty sure you must have done. I'll see you in the next one.